Hi, everyone. So this is our presentation on language learning and teaching for our second week of our course here. So the questions that we'll be addressing is how do students develop proficiency in a new language? How can different theories of language learning inform effective practice? How do you develop your own personal approach to providing effective language and content instruction for English language learners? So just things that we'll be addressing and considering as we move through the presentation. So first language, and we typically use L1 when we're discussing first language acquisition theories, but babies cannot talk, but by the age of 5 have a fully developed language system. So something really interesting to keep in mind. Two major theories evolved to explain this. So we have Skinner's theory, which is that children learn their first language through imitation and positive reinforcement. And it was a common view between the 1940s and the 1950s. Then we have Chomsky's theory, which challenged Skinner's views in 1959 by demonstrating that children were able to produce language and unique utterances well beyond what they hear and imitate. So he hypothesized that children have an innate ability to learn language, and language acquisition device and universal grammar enables children to figure out the underlying rules of language on their own. So this theory in particular was revolutionary, and it still remains a very influential piece of work. Most linguistics agree children have genetic predisposition for language, but there's a lot of new research emerging that kind of builds on some of the challenges of Chomsky's idea here. So second language acquisition theories are cognitive approaches to second language acquisition, highly influenced by Chomsky still because it was such an influential piece. Most interested in what is happening inside the brain of the language learner. And there are many competing theories and debates, but there are some plausible ones with important implications, especially for teachers and those of us in education. So there's Krashen's 5 interrelated hypothesis, the interaction hypothesis, comprehensible output hypothesis, noticing hypothesis, processable theory, input processing model, and transfer from L1 to L2, from first language to second language. So in the 1980s, Stephen Krashen proposed 5 interrelated hypotheses. It was the acquisition learning hypothesis, natural order hypothesis, the monitor hypothesis, the input hypothesis, and the effective filter hypothesis. So we'll be kind of going through those and breaking those down just a little bit. So the acquisition learning hypothesis is that the subconscious process, so it's not aware that it's happening when children are learning a new language and there's language acquisition. Once we acquire something, we're not aware that we possess this new knowledge, and subconsciously we're storing all of this in our brains. So when there's language learning, like what we did in school, it's a conscious process. We know we're learning, there's rules and there's grammar. And because of the complexity of language, the vast majority is acquired rather than consciously learned. So consider that, what it means to be acquired but not learned. The natural order hypothesis is that we acquire the parts of language in a predictable order. So order for the first language and the second language is similar but not identical. Some grammatical items tend to come earlier and others tend to come later. So an example of this is the third person singular, S, Bob looks at his watch. That comes later. So the natural order appears to be immune to deliberate teaching. So it cannot change the natural order through drills, explanations, exercise, which means that all of the grammar drills that sometimes occur in a classroom, that may not be making any sort of difference because a child is just not there yet to be able to, understand it and learn it. And it won't be acquired until its time has come. The monitor hypothesis is that language use mostly depends on acquired linguistic competence. So it's conscious learning has one function only as a monitor or as an editor. And after producing some language, when speaking or writing, our monitor can kick in to correct it if it's necessary. So it's like a little language teacher in our heads reminding us of the rules. This is the monitor that's keeping us in check. The input comprehension, sometimes that's what it's called, hypothesis, answers the most important question: how does language acquisition occur? So, how does it happen? And we acquire language in one way: when we understand messages or we obtain the comprehensible input. So we acquire language when we understand what we hear or what we're reading, and when we understand the message. And that's really important, right? So we need to be able to understand what we're hearing and what we're reading, what's in front of us, but then also the message. So if you think back to that scenario from week one with the two girls with different teachers, it's really important as a content area teacher, we're trying to provide students as much as possible that they could hold on to. So the website maybe in a native language so that they can fill in the gaps with what they're not understanding from the classroom. Taking a look at student samples, all of that helps them piece this together so that they can understand what they're hearing, what they're reading, and the message. So this I+1 idea is the I stands for a student's current level of proficiency, where they currently are. The +1 is the input that's slightly above their level. So a student can move from I to I+1 by understanding the input containing I+1. So if we give them information that's slightly above their level, they're able to move forward with this I+1. We can do this with the help of previously acquired linguistic competence and context, providing them context. The effective filter hypothesis is that their effective variables do not impact language acquisition directly, but may prevent a student from understanding a topic or this comprehensible input. Examples of anxiety, low self esteem, seeing themselves as an outsider of a language group, all of this then prevents understanding something because these variables kind of deter it. If a effective filter is high, it blocks the input, so students are less likely to understand it. And if it's low, it allows for more comprehensible input. So if these outside variables, these examples, aren't necessarily an issue, then that input, that information that we're trying to relay to students becomes easier for them to understand. So that's why, as teachers, we need to create a very supportive classroom. So that effective filter, all of these variables that are hard for us as teachers to help them with, we can now lower some of that for them. So anxiety, if we're able to offer a supportive classroom, hopefully the anxiety level decreases and students can learn without so much frustration or anxiety around it. So the critiques of Krashen's theories are that he oversimplified this complex process in second language acquisition. They can't be proven. They can't operationalize things like I or +1 or specify the exact sequence in natural order, so nothing is super specific or set in stone. It de-emphasizes language output, so he doesn't really focus on the importance of speaking and writing and the interaction between people, which is something that it's one of the biggest critiques that we've seen here. And there's some people misinterpret Krashen's theories as opposing all direct teaching, that these theories go against like just teaching students directly language skills, or when we talk about phonics, for example, it goes kind of against that. Nonetheless, Krashen's theories have inspired research and have led to new theories that have been built upon his ideas. So there are also these cognitive approaches to second language acquisition, which I mentioned in one of the earlier slides. So this interaction hypothesis is by Long, and it's that interaction is essential for language acquisition to occur. So this kind of addresses one of the critiques from Krashen, and that input and interactions can be modified to maximize comprehension. There's the comprehensible output by Swain, and that's speaking forces learners to confront the limits of their language ability and push them to find better ways to get their message across. There's the noticing hypothesis by Schmidt, and that's nothing is learned unless students notice it in the input. And the processability theory, and that's the sequence in which learners acquire certain language features depends on how easy they are to process. So these are some more approaches to language acquisition. One more, the input processing model by Van Patten. And this is that language acquisition happens in only one way, and all learners must undergo it. Learners must have exposure to communicative input, and they must process it. The brain must organize data. Learners must acquire output procedures, and they need to interact with other speakers. There's no way around these fundamental aspects of acquisition. They are basics. So, lots of exposure to communicating, to being in these scenarios where they have to communicate with other people to get what they want, and that the brain will ultimately organize this information. There's no way around it. So now we have this transfer from first language to second language. How does that happen? So there's a positive transfer, and that students are able to take much of what they know from their first language and transfer it to their second language. And that students who have the literacy skills in their first language will likely make rapid progress developing English literacy skills. And that is because they're able to transfer the information, right? So I think the complication for teachers is when we have a student who doesn't necessarily have all of the literacy skills, all of the foundational skills in their first language, and now they're trying to add English to it. They can't transfer that. And so it becomes challenging. And that's why there are a lot of bilingual programs for students, especially when there's higher numbers of English language learners, because they're able to support them so that they can learn both languages. And so when we have a student who has a great foundation in their first language, it does make it a little bit easy for them to transfer those skills. Students who have substantial content area knowledge in their first language do not need to relearn the concepts in English because they already have a basic understanding of it. And so they just need those language skills demonstrated to them. They just need it to be identified or like explicitly stated, and then they can begin to understand it. There's also a negative transfer, which is sometimes called interference, and that's applying our first language syntax rules to English. More research needs to be done to understand what does and what doesn't transfer, because we're not quite sure about that. But teaching for transfer enables students to draw what they know from their first language and learning their second language. So the sociocultural perspective on language learning surrounds the idea that the learner facilitates the language learning process. So it's all about the learner facilitating it. New terms being used to challenge terms that emerge from traditional cognitive approaches. So home language instead of first language, native language or primary language. And so home language then kind of, it maybe is just a term that we're thinking is better to be used instead of first language or native language. And sometimes there are a lot of assumptions with that. Is it really their first language, or is this just the language they speak at home? And so we're trying to finely tune the language that we're using around all of this as well. We like to use emergent bilinguals instead of ELLs. English as an additional language or English as a new language rather than English as a second language. And we do have to be careful. A lot of our programs, especially in public schools, are called ESL, English as a second language, but oftentimes it's not a second language. It could be the first time they're learning a language. So in some cases, the first time they're getting some formal training in a language, but in other cases, it may be a third language. And so that's why it's important to change it. Some schools refer to it as ESOL, ESOL, and that's English for students of other languages. So that's another term that's out there. But once again, we're trying to make the language positive and appropriate for our students. New language may also refer to English proficient students in dual or world language programs. So the New York Bilingual Common Core Initiative uses terms new language and home language, and the new language arts progression and the home language arts progression. So Heim's notion of communicative competence provides the basis for communicative language teaching and content-based instruction. So these are some of those sociolinguistic contributions. Linguistically diverse varieties are rule-governed and logical systems and should not be unfairly stigmatized by speakers of dominant varieties. This is the idea that because we're the dominant language, we then are creating these terms that may unfairly label students, may unfairly place a stigma on them. So we see African American vernacular English that used to be referred to as Ebonics, and we're changing that. Tex-Mex is sometimes used to refer to this like combination of English and Spanish, and it used to be referred to as Spanglish. So trying to make sure that we're making these more appropriate. There's also the zone of proximal development and scaffolding. So this is something you may have learned in another education class, but it is an active theory here by Vygotsky. So it's learning is a social activity and knowledge is constructed through interaction and collaboration with others. And this zone of proximal development is a domain or a space where children can reach a higher level of knowledge and performance with the support of an adult or another knowledgeable person. And this is where scaffolding comes into play. So this is the assistance that's given in zone of proximal development so that slowly but surely a student or a child can get to an achieved standard or learning. So it gives much emphasis to the role of speaking and collaborating. So it's very important for that in a second language learning. And there's collaboration interactions as key to language learning and teaching. Teachers' role as a skilled expert who interact and collaborate with students and carefully plan and scaffold instruction. So, and this is all taken into consideration when we get back to the SIOP model a little bit later here. It's this idea that we are offering plenty of opportunities for students to collaborate, to interact. We're still there as a teacher and as a facilitator when needed, and we're providing scaffolding to support those language learners so that they can meet the standards that we've still addressed for them. So language socialization research, and this is really how children are socialized through language in their respective speech communities across sociocultural contexts. So when we're working with our English language learners, we're not just teaching them a new language, we're also helping them socialize, become part of a community of English language speakers in their classes. And that's why it's important to consider, well, when we ask a question or when we're commanding something, how do we go about doing that? And what does that exchange look like from one person to the next? Because that could very much be a cultural thing that our English language learners may not automatically know. There's also bilingual and multilingual pluralist perspectives. And this is that there are sociocultural approaches that increasingly look at the education of English language learners through a bilingual lens. So guiding principles for making decisions about policies, programming, curriculum, instruction, assessment, all of that, we need to keep in mind the striving for equity and affirming linguistic and cultural identities, so changing that language so it's more affirming, promoting developmental bilingualism, and structuring for integration. So bilingual education programs, they use two languages for instructional purposes. And the bilingual perspective can be embraced by teachers who work with English language learners or emergent bilinguals in any type of instructional program. See translanguaging as an integral part of natural and normal ways of using the language in everyday life. So both languages here. There's a monolingual perspective, which language as problem. And that is this idea that we're reluctant to allow students to use any of their home language in the classroom. And there are some bilingual programs that insist on strict separation of languages. So there are a lot of different ideas here, and because we just don't know what fits best, and we really do have to question, is there one way that fits best for our students? There are a lot of these different options and ideas and beliefs within the language acquisition community. So this comes back to the idea that all teachers are language teachers, right? All teachers share the responsibility of helping our English language learners develop their proficiency in English and use those speaking and writing skills for academic purposes across content areas. So content teachers teach lessons with both language and content objectives, and we'll be practicing this a little bit. There are several points of collaboration between bilingual, ESL, and content area teachers. So planning lessons that address the English language proficiency standards. And so this is what I mean when I talk about like a team approach here. Really, everyone who's there to support our English language learners should also be working together to plan lessons. And maybe as a content area teacher, and I found this to be the case, you are planning the lesson, but maybe seeking some input from those other people who might offer additional resources or additional ideas. You're providing support to identify the language demands in the content area, writing appropriate language objectives, and differentiating instruction. And all of that's included in the SIOP model, so we'll be sure to go over it. There's also traditional second language teaching approaches and methods. So it's the grammar translation method, and this is the idea that you memorize the grammar rules, and then there's a translation of sentences between both language. This is definitely the opposition to outdated and effective method that's inspired new methods. So we definitely see this as very old school. Audiolingual method came about in the 1930s, and this was influenced by behaviorism. And there was this memorization of dialogues and grammar drills, so like writing out a script and memorizing that. And then there's also the natural approach, and this is the application of Krashen's theories to the language learning classroom. So there's an emphasis on providing comprehensible input in an enjoyable classroom context so that students can naturally acquire the language. There's also the communicative language teaching, and this is the most favorite approach of all of the approaches. It's based on communication competence, so being able to communicate efficiently, and students learn the language and are able to communicate with other speakers. So that's why it's most favorable. We have to really consider, what are we preparing our students for? And sometimes it's really just to communicate with others and be part of society. And so that's why this one is favored so much. So classroom activities focus on authentic and meaningful communication. There's some focus on form, which is typically means grammar, because it's necessary to comprehend and like break down, input, but also produce output. And there are a wide range of communicative language teaching approaches, methods, and strategies. There's content-based instruction, and we talked about this a little bit last week, but it's a type of communicative language teaching, and it's a selected content area becomes a meaningful context for authentic communication as learners collaborate to complete carefully designed academic tasks. And then ESL teachers use math, social studies, or science as vehicles for language instruction. And so what's interesting about this is that the ESL teachers are not the experts in those content areas. The focus was more on learning the language than learning the content area concepts. And that progressed into sheltered instruction here, where we see specifically designed academic instruction in English. And this is where content teachers are trained to modify instruction to make it comprehensible for English language learners. So there are a couple different approaches to it. One is the cognitive academic language learning approach. And then one is the sheltered instruction observation protocol, and that's SIOP. This is the one that is probably most frequently used and utilized in many different classrooms. So when we're talking about whole language, multiple intelligence, and cooperative learning, it's not specifically designed for English language learning teaching, but they are suited for a language classroom. So whole language places an emphasis on teaching reading strategies and skills within a meaningful context for stories, poems, or other text. Multiple intelligences are used to maximize learning according to a particular set of intelligences like linguistics, logical, spatial, musical, kinesthetic. And there's cooperative learning, and that's the use of small groups within which students collaborate to solve problems or complete academic tasks. So critical pedagogy that goes along with this was developed by Paulo Freire in the 1960s, and it was focused on liberating oppressed students through transformative education. So freeing these students, so to speak. Many teachers recognize the importance of helping English language learners understand and confront these unequal power relations so that they can improve their lives and society as they learn English and academic content. But it rejects the banking model of education where teachers are simply just making deposits of information into students. It involves problem posing. So it involves students to be reflectively thinking, gathering knowledge, collaborating, and really help students find and express their voice. So there's no single method or approach that's appropriate for every classroom or for every student, which is important to keep in mind. But the idea is that, and at least for this presentation for me, is that you can draw on a variety of methods and approaches and kind of develop your own personal approach as you're observing your students and deciding what's best for them. And so here are some questions that might help guide that or guide your understanding at least. What are the students' strengths and needs? What are the instructional goals for that class or that lesson? What is likely to be challenging about these goals for these students? Which strategies can help address these challenges? And how will you know whether these strategies are effective? And even if you just have these questions and maybe bounce them off of a team, that even allows for a deeper understanding of a student and what may be most appropriate for him or her. Teachers' personal approach should be grounded in a set of core principles. So, engaging all learners in the lesson, making learners the focus of the lesson, provide maximum opportunities for student participation, be tolerant of learners' mistakes, develop their confidence, respond to their difficulties and build on them, use a maximum amount of student to student activities, promote cooperation among learners, and address learners' needs and interests. And a lot of this is probably what, as teachers, we're already hoping and trying to do. So, as a takeaway here, whether one takes a cognitive or sociocultural view of second language acquisition, researchers and educators agree on the need for students to receive comprehensible input. That means like information, and to engage in meaningful interaction with other speakers. So, it is important that we're still teaching them and allowing them to interact with their peers. When teachers know their students well and understand the sociocultural context, they can draw on their knowledge of language teaching and learning theories, methods, and approaches to inform their own principled approach to providing the type of learning environment that builds on their students' strengths and addresses their unique needs. It simply comes down to knowing your students and seeking out information so that you can best meet their needs and help them be successful.